So, welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to talk about herbal syrups. And sweet is not just a spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. The sweet flavor has a long history of being associated with nourishment and soothing the body, and demulcents, or a lot of plants that have the quality of sweetness can also be soothing to things that are dry. So herbal syrups can be for fun. I'll give you a couple of my favorite recipes that are just for fun. And syrups can be more for medicinal reasons. So historically used things like cough syrup that had a very specific purpose. There's nothing in this video that will replace any connection you have with a medical provider. I'm not intending to give any medical advice or diagnose or treat anyone. I just want to share some things that I have learned in my kitchen and I enjoy sharing from my kitchen. So, basic definition of an herbal syrup is something sweet plus plant or herb. Now, sweet can be sugar. You can use plain old cane sugar, your favorite sugar cane sugar. You can use maple syrup. You can use honey. It makes another really great way to sweeten. You can also use glycerin, which, if you're sticking around for the class tomorrow night, we're going to spend more time talking about glycerin because it's also used in making tinctures that we'll talk about tomorrow night. So vegetable glycerin tastes really sweet, and really what the sweetness is doing is preserving your plant material. It's serving that function as well as that sweetness, and tastes good and makes everything go down easier. Each of these sweeteners have a different way of extracting the plant material into the sweet liquid, and I'll go through some of those. So a simple syrup, and you can Google simple syrup and there are thousands of recipes out there, is often sugar, your cane sugar, with water. Now, James Green, who is an herbalist that teaches a lot about how to make different herbal products in your kitchen, James Green has this recipe that gives you an opportunity to make a simple syrup that is really designed for that preserving aspect of the sugar. And in his recipe, it is 85 grams of sugar. And if you don't have a scale, it's roughly a third of my jar, somewhere between a quarter and a third of my jar. And the measurements don't have to be exact. So if you get close to this, you should be fine in terms of preserving with simple syrup. So this is 85 grams that I've weighed out on my kitchen scale in a 10-ounce jar. And then he suggests adding 45 milliliters of distilled water. He suggests distilled, and this is just purified water. Whatever water you use, you want to make sure that it's something you want medicine to be taken with, right? So tap water, if that's all you have access to, then it's maybe better for you than some bottled waters out there. The tap water is monitored more closely than some of those bottled waters, but I say filter, even if you have like a charcoal Brita filter, that can be really helpful to filter out the water. So that's 47 milliliters, and you can see my sugar is still very obviously there. And in this recipe, I'm using room temperature water with that sugar, and I'm shaking it like this for a day, and it will dissolve over time. If you want it to go faster, you can either put it in a warm water bath so that it heats up the water, or you can add warm water. You can go ahead and heat that water before it goes in, so you can melt your sugar. So this is super concentrated, really sweet, simple syrup designed to make an herbal syrup. Because the sugar is so concentrated in this water, it'll do a really nice job of preserving whatever I add to it. So that's one sweetener. Honey and maple syrup I would use in a really similar way, and they already are concentrated sweetness enough that they provide that preservative aspect. Especially honey, if you can get raw, local honey, that's kind of the best. Lots of antimicrobial action, and honey makes a really nice preservative. With honey, if you're using half honey with any decoction, which I'll talk about in a minute, you could preserve whatever it is for up to a year. In Florida, I'd say that year would be in the fridge, but sugar has a really nice way of preserving whatever you add to it. So, simple syrup, honey, glycerin, maple syrup. That's your simple syrup, and we'll keep an eye on it so you can see how quickly, even with room temperature water, it becomes a nice simple syrup. So there are 3 different ways that you can get the medicinal quality into your sweetness. One of them is decocting plant material in a pot on your stove. So elderberry syrup is a really common syrup in our house, and this elderberry recipe is just divine, especially in this season of our lives. It incorporates some of those really nice demulcent herbs with I put a half a cup of elderberries, and these were dried elderberries. I started with 2 cups of water in my pot. I added a half a cup of dried elderberries. 9 grams of licorice, which is a really nice demulcent, sweet, nourishing herb that goes really nicely with those elderberries. And 9 grams is like a half a teaspoon of the dried, cut, and sifted licorice. Then I added about a half a teaspoon of black pepper, and I let that simmer for about 30 minutes. I'll show you. And when you're making it, you're letting it simmer. Your goal is to get to about half of your original liquid. And you can see in my pot here, the water line is much higher here where we started, and then the more I cooked it, the water evaporated out, and so I'm left with this really nice, dark, antioxidant rich, high in vitamin C, elderberry decoction. In this decoction, I will add 2 tablespoons of dried thyme. And a lot of your culinary herbs are filled with their own cootie fighting abilities. But I find that thyme and elderberry together, the flavors can be really nice, especially with a little hint of that black pepper. We're not going savory with this elderberry syrup, but we're definitely going to a more warm, nourishing place with the flavor. So this is 2 tablespoons of thyme, and that was dried. If I had it fresh, I might use a little bit, I would use more. My general rule around fresh versus dried is dried would be half. And then if I had fresh, I would double whatever I would normally have used of the dried. In general, not all herbs translate that well. But rosemary, I happen to have here. It grows really easily here in Central Florida. It has its own cootie fighting abilities. It smells amazing. And I just chop it up. And this chopping is mostly to open up the cell of the rosemary, the plant, so that I can access more of that medicine. And I would just throw it into my pot. I could put that fresh rosemary in my mortar and pestle and pound it just a little bit. I could put it in a bowl and hit it with the back end of a knife. That works as well. Just be careful of the glass. And then I will stir this. And you'll notice that I didn't put the thyme and the rosemary in while it was simmering. I waited until my pot was turned off and I threw it off. I turned it off. So the more dense plant materials I decoct or I simmer, and then those leafy plant materials don't need as much time to be able to extract the qualities that I'm going for. So I would let that sit for about 5 minutes, maybe 10, maybe 20. Mostly I'm letting the pot cool down a little bit because I'm going to strain. And when I strain, I don't want to burn myself. And the next step would be adding sweetener, and I'm planning to add honey. So I want to make sure that honey doesn't get cooked. So everyone that strains their syrup or tinctures have a different method of collecting, and this just happens to work for me. This is a pitcher that I've had for a really long time, and I found a jar that jars often will fit right in there. And the joy of having a jar is that I have measurements already on the inside of on the side of the jar, so it helps me to kind of eyeball what I'm putting inside. This funnel has a little filter in it that can be really helpful to take out those bigger plant pieces, but just remember, whatever filter you're using, that you want to make sure the holes are smaller than whatever the plant material is, because you want to get all of that plant material out. So because with this, I want to make sure I'm getting the plant material out, I'm going to use just a plain cotton muslin rag that I use for straining. I find that the holes are really small, so I'm able to get all of that plant material out, and it's big enough that I'll be able to squeeze all the good liquids out of it. So I let this sit for a few minutes so that it's not super hot, and that's really important because you don't want to burn yourself. There are a lot of different elderberry recipes out there. Herbalist Christine Brown does an herbal roots zine, and it's designed specifically for kids to learn about herbal preparations. And in her herbal roots zine, she has a recipe that is just a cup of elderberries, 2 cups of water, simmered like that, strained off, and added to honey, and call it elderberry syrup. So it's super simple. And I find with kids, it can be really nice to keep the flavor palette simple with just having those elderberries. But if I'm having elderberry syrup all the time, sometimes I like to mix it up. So thyme and rosemary can be really nice. garlic elderberry syrup is surprisingly delicious. Ginger, hibiscus can be really nice to add in those elderberries to make syrup. And ginger syrup on its own can be really nice, and it would be the same process. I would just have my water in the pot, I'd add my plant material, and then let it simmer down to a half or a third of my original volume. So you can see I'm twisting my rag so that I'm able to extract all of that elderberry decoction out of my liquid, out of my plant material here. There are pieces of fancy equipment that help you get all of that liquid out, but I really like the squeezing process. Helps me put a little more love into my syrups. Okay. If you don't want to use a muslin cloth, other things that work really well are cheesecloth. And cheesecloth you can purchase in packaging so that you're able to fold it the number of times that makes sense for your straining, whatever you're straining. And depending on the plant material that you're using, elderberries on their own are kind of bigger, so I don't need as fine a mesh. But other plant material like that thyme gets really tiny. So I strained it. And you can see in my jar, I have about 6 ounces of that lovely decoction. It smells so good. I wish you were here so you could enjoy it too. So that is my elderberry decoction. And then I add the same volume in honey. So this is one way to make a syrup, is using the decoction plus honey. What's that honey? Can't get it open. And this is just a raw local honey, and I'm adding 6 ounces. So I had 6 ounces of that decoction, and I'm adding 6 ounces of honey. And I'll put my lid on. Makes a really fun science experiment too. Look at all the color. You can tell by that the antioxidants, that purple color. It's also really high in vitamin C. Herbal syrups, elderberry syrup can be really nice to keep on hand year-round, but I find I especially lean on it in times when there are cooties going around and I want to really protect myself and my family. And I take 1 teaspoon to a tablespoon a day, unless I have an active cootie going on, and then I bump that up to every 3 hours. But we're hearing really mixed science around using elderberry with the current virus going around that we're all trying to avoid. So I say elderberry syrup, great, as long as you don't have active infection, and then just stop. So that's my elderberry syrup. I can store it in the fridge. That half and half will last in the fridge up to a year, because the honey is really going to preserve it. It won't last that long in the fridge, but it could stay there for that long. But that's just a gauge that you want to be mindful of. You know, if I take it out of the fridge and it has bubbles or the lid pops or it smells funny, it smells like alcohol at all, then I know I need to just compost it.